There is a place up north where life and death meet and an indescribable being speaks to you in your nightmares. Listen to Hello from the Hollowoods wherever you listen to podcasts. It is no secret that I am a fan of horror, but there was a time growing up where I hated horror in probably the most hypocritical way. I would watch horror movies, sometimes even binging through a bunch of them at a time, but I would voice my complaints about how scary horror movies are. And whenever it was suggested we watch a horror movie, I would say no, and then most likely end up watching it anyway. Yeah, I was 6 years old, but back then to me, Shaun of the Dead was the scariest movie I've ever seen in my life. Which is very funny considering not even 6 years later, my favorite movie franchise for a while ended up being the Paranormal Activity series. I just really like ghosts. But even when I got to middle school and got into ghost hunting shows, I decided that someday I wanted to be a paranormal investigator. And yeah, I still thought horror movies were not for me. That is, until I binged watched the first season of The Walking Dead on the day that season 2 first started. And listen, you could argue how good or bad the show is. I have my own gripes with it, but that show did end up changing my life. It made me obsessed with the zombie genre and expanded my obsessions of ghosts and cryptids to include monster movies, slashers, vampire murder movies, and all the other things that I used to pretend to shun. I embraced horror, openly loving every second of it. And then, The Walking Dead introduced Aisha and Tara, a lesbian couple who were only in the show for a short amount of time together. I already said that was also a formidable baby gay's first on-screen rep, at least first on-screen rep with the awareness of what it was. And as I said before, I currently got my gripes with The Walking Dead, but it still was an impactful piece of media to me growing up. But I bring that up in the context of the topic for today's video, talking about what queer horror is, and talking about queerness in media years prior, media now, and the works of other LGBT creators. This is a topic that I've been wanting to do a video on for a while, and I realized earlier this year that I just did not know what I wanted to do for my June video. Since I'd like to make my June videos LGBT focused, I just decided this is the time for me to start this video. I could do that. This is a topic that I've been wanting to do a video of for a while, and I realized earlier this year that I just did not know what I wanted to do for my June video, since I like to make my June videos LGBT focused. But I did remember something that happened last year. I was asked by a coworker when talking about my own queer horror webcomic In Harmony what exactly queer horror is. And I had to sit and think, well, is there a definition? I could talk about the queer aspects of In Harmony. I could talk about certain media through a queer lens, and modern media that is labeled as queer media, but can it be defined in one way, or is it a more fluid definition? Take my hand, fellow watcher, and we will find an answer together. But before we start, let's talk about the art for today's video. I do this series of paintings I call my Light series, where I combine electrical lighting with the natural environment, and I stick a character in it. I honestly can do a whole video about these paintings, as I don't do them often, and only when the inspiration strikes. And when it does strike, it hits hard. You gotta be in the mood. I also made a new character recently for a series of stories that I've been rolling around in my head and had the idea for this piece with said character. His name is Moriarty, and he is my mushroom hive mind boy. I love him. He's very stinky, and I hope to yap about him more, because in the course of a week, when I first came up to this character, I went from, oh, this character idea is interesting, I should explore it, to, oh my god, this is some sweet, sweet tragedy here, and just sticking all the little things that I love cooking up story-wise with this character in it, and just, I just love thinking about this guy. He's got so much going on. And I have to scream about my boy and his whole deal, but that will probably be a subject for a different video. So I hope you enjoy him and all of his horrible glory for this video. Now that that's out of the way, let's get on to the video. So in order for me to get into what queer horror is, we're going to have to talk about horror and its history with queerness. This is going to be a briefish history lesson that's not going to cover everything, just because there is so much. You could go into detail with a lot of different things about film history and queer horror and horror in general and like the topic of homosexuality, but that would be a video that is super, super long, and I am not a certified educationer. Besides, my own personal studies about the intersectionality between queerness and horror came from both a critical sexuality course I took in the beginning of my time in university, and through a bunch of other film and animation history classes that I took during my time in school. If you do want a fantastic documentary that tackles the exact topic more thoroughly, then I suggest watching Queer for Fear, a documentary that talks about queer horror history through the perspectives of other queer individuals. And also, for transparency's sake, all sources I reference from can be found in the description of this video. I'll be mentioning some films and books, but because this history lesson is supposed to be on the briefer side, I'm not going to go too deep into each piece of media that I talk about for this video. But if you do care for some spoilers for 100-year-old books and a couple of movies that came out in like the 70s, then consider this the only warning you're going to get. Although I've mentioned queer horror in the context of films and shows multiple times in this video already, it can actually be traced back to even farther than that, to books such as Carmilla and Frankenstein, and other slightly more modernish books such as one everybody's probably thinking of when they think of queer horror books, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. I have read Frankenstein and The Picture of Dorian Gray, not Carmilla yet sadly, and they both are unique in the way that they write their monsters. With Frankenstein, the story has its monster existing in a world he is othered in, desperate to belong and to find someone to accept him for what he is. And in A Picture of Dorian Gray, we have Basil's own borderline obsessive love for Dorian himself. We get not only early horror stories, but stories that subtly explore themes related to queer people. When films started gaining traction, Hollywood was receiving pressure from the Catholic Church due to things that were portrayed in movies the church deemed morally corrupt. So in 1934, the Hays Code was created. The Hays Code was a series of guidelines that said what could or couldn't be shown in films, with things such as the use of profanity and slurs, substance use, alcohol, and most notably, anything with homosexuality. I say notably because by the time 1968 rolled around, the Hays Code has been replaced with the modern film rating system that we know today, but even before then, certain rules in the code were already being broken. The presentation of homosexuality in the movies being one of the last banned items from the list Hollywood still avoided. So to get around the code, films had to stick to queer coding or with horror. Queer coding is a way to give traits to a character or a story to suggest a more subtle queer storyline. One more modern example of this today, just because I'm a huge podcast listener and I've been thinking about the show a lot in my head recently, would be John Doe from Malevolent, whose story involves him finding his own identity and who he is, while fighting the previous expectations that are given to him as the King in Yellow. John's story in the fandom has been compared to how some have experienced their own discovery of their gender identity, with his rejection of his old identity as the King in Yellow and his goal of finding who he is now while accepting who he once was. Films with openly queer characters were less likely to get greenlit, but if that character was a villain, or if their downfall came about due to their perceived queerness, then these movies were more likely to get made. Things slowly began changing after that as Hollywood began to slowly introduce more nuanced and less offensive portrayals of queer characters, mostly as we're getting into like the 90s and the 2000s. Of course, it started with adult-oriented shows and movies, but then in the late 2010s with more children's media, and now we have shows with queer characters who are written more openly and respectively than anyone could have imagined back in the 1960s. So what does that have to do with queer horror? Horror has always been a reflection of society's fears at the moment, and you can see what they are if you compare what people are scared about in real life with the kind of horror movies that are being made. I mean, how many trailers of horror movies have you seen in the last few years that are about killer AIs and machines? Now, pair that with current discussion on AI usage and how it damages our environment and privacy currently. Horror movies in the past were no different, using the metaphor of horror to show people's disgust with certain things and showing the true societies and how the good ones overcome these horrible monstrosities. A lot of queer portrayals in older films do not give queer people the kindest image, particularly to trans women. Think of movies like Silence of the Lambs, where Buffalo Bill kidnaps and kills young women so he can wear their skin, or Sleepaway Camp, that is well known for its plot twist at the end that is very troubling given the context of it. The queer character in the movie is usually the monster, whether it's the seductive female vampire who targets the unsuspecting and innocent female lead, or the abnormal character transforming into a horrible monster the main leads have to fight. Queer themes have also been used to portray the monstrous as a thing to shun, and to not fall into their temptations, and encourage viewers to stick to the moral and usually heteronormative Christian path. My own unpopular opinion is, although there are a lot of older movies that are deeply offensive for different reasons, it's not entirely fair to dismiss a movie or flat out say someone is a horrible person for enjoying them. Silence of the Lambs and Sleepaway Camp are not really what I'm thinking of with this thought. I can understand why people are a little bit uneasy with going back to those movies, even though I don't think you should hate somebody who enjoys them. Now, with those movies, I personally have not sat and watched them, but I have studied clips from them. As I said in the aforementioned classes that I've taken in the past, we did have to watch clips from these movies and analyze the queer themes in them, as well as like some of the other aspects of those movies that are a bit problematic today. But the movie that I am thinking of specifically for this portion of this video is Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is actually another small and partial reason to why I wanted to make a video about queer horror specifically. I only see it occasionally, so it's not like a massive problem, but it is something that I do see occasionally and that I've thought about a lot. But I will sometimes see a post or something that someone has made on Tumblr or TikTok. It's usually a younger person, but they talk about how deeply offensive they believe some pieces of media are and how they portray queer people, and that anyone who enjoys those pieces of media is a horrible person. The queer community doesn't want them in it. And almost every single time I see one of these lists, the first thing on their list of horrible, irredeemable movies that makes you a horrible, irredeemable person is Rocky Horror Picture Show. I've also seen it with books like Dracula and The Picture of Dorian Gray, as well as other films, some more understandable than others, but like, come on, are you going to really argue that Jennifer's Body is just as problematic as Silence of the Lambs? But I digress. Like I said, this has been a sentiment that I've seen mostly from a younger audience, and most of the time, they grew up used to seeing more queer people represented on TV, and even more so on the internet. I mean, like, back when Legend of Korra came out, I was in high school, and my little sister was in elementary. So, like, I can understand the difference and, like, cultural stuff going on. I believe this comes from a different standard because they have seen more queer people represented on TV and even more so on the internet and a more positive life. And they believe that older media should be upheld to the standards of more modern media. Because modern media, most queer stories are more positive stories, or at least positive in the way of like queer representation. And I'm not saying it's not a bad thing to think like that. I do believe that more modern media these days, we could let go of a lot of the old stereotypes in older media. But I don't think going about and being mean about it is the right way to go. There are a lot of older members of the LGBT community who loved Rocky Horror Picture Show when it came out. And my honest opinion is, if you're a young queer person, make sure you're actually spending time with other queer people in person, not just with strangers online or with your friends. And also talk to older LGBT people yourself. Not everybody in the community is young and chronically online, and there are different perspectives of being queer that I think are very important to consider outside of your own. And also that media literacy is important. You could watch a movie with problematic themes and deconstruct why those themes are problematic without always having to put a disclaimer that says, you enjoyed the movie, but you know the problematic stuff and you're not okay with it. Like, I'm not gonna do that with every single piece of media that might have one slightly problematic thing. But for those who may not have seen the movie, let's talk about Rocky Horror Picture Show. Rocky Horror Picture Show is a 1975 film about a couple whose car breaks down on the side of the road. They end up going to a nearby castle where they become the guests of Dr. Frankenfurter, who's a mad scientist from an alien planet. They specifically call themselves a transvestite from the planet Transsexual from the galaxy Transylvania, which honestly that last bit did get a little giggle at me when I read it up. It's been years since I last watched the movie, and I completely forgot that was also a part of the story. Well, Frankenfurter seduces both of the main leads and starts a series of events that led to his death after his fellow aliens decide to mutiny against him. Despite the parts of the movie that are probably not okay now, Rocky Horror Picture Show is considered an iconic piece of queer media. It's a very camp musical, and it's still very fun to watch, even now, and a lot of older queers still hold the movie close when representation did not really get any better than that. I mean, like I said earlier, I grew up where the best queer rep I could ever hope for was Korrasami becoming canon at the end of Legend of Korra just because they held hands. That wasn't that long ago, but they're also not what we see on screen now. Not when we have whole queer romance shows like Heartstopper out there. Which again goes into, at least to me, why I am passionate about the topic of queer horror. Should the problematic portrayals in Rocky Horror, or Silence of the Lambs, or Sleepaway Camp be analyzed and critiqued? Yes! Should these movies never be watched again because of them, and we should shame anyone who still enjoys them? Absolutely not! It's history, and sometimes it's not pretty, but if we discard every uncomfortable and sometimes even atrocious thing from the past and forget that it happens or exists, then we're gonna eventually repeat it. And at least coming from an American who is living in America in the year 2025, I think the last thing any of us needs to be doing is flat out ignoring history. Now that we talked about queer horror in the past, I want to bring us back to the present. We could take what happened and learn from it. So if queer horror still exists, how have we moved on past the original problematic themes with horror movies and what they were known for to now? It's no secret that I'm a huge podcast listener, especially a fictional podcast, and I love the horror podcasts that exist now. Revolutionary shows like Welcome to Night Vale, shows that exploded like the Magnus Archives, and many more shows that are pushing the boundaries of storytelling and representation that most other media has not caught up to. And I decided to invite one of those creators on for today's video. Since I started doing these long-form videos, I had juggled the idea that someday I would be able to bring people on as just guests. I did that a little bit with my Insect Nightmares video, where I brought Asa on to do a skit for something that happened with us some years ago, but I always wanted to do more with that. So I took that step and I reached out to William Wellman of Hello from the Hollywoods. William is an amazing storyteller, best known as the voice of our indescribable host, Nicky Nick, who tells us about the goings-ons of the citizens of the dark and mysterious Hollywoods, all through our dreams. Hello from the Hollywoods, in my opinion, is one of my favorite pieces of media by far, absolutely, but it also is one of the first one I think of when I think about queer horror. It pushes the intersectionality between queerness and horror in such a way that I find so incredible. This interview was a blast to do, and it gave me a lot more to think about when it comes to the topic of queer horror. So I hope you guys enjoy it too.
Also, for anyone who has not listened to Hello from the Hollywoods yet, 1, you should go do that. But 2, we do talk about spoilers up to episode 192, titled Lies. And I want to give you all a head up about that in case you are somebody who does not like spoilers in your podcasts.
Awesome. Okay. So I do want to start this off by specifically asking you, how would you define queer horror? And, how would you kind of compare it now to, queer horror now in, a modern day kind of lens to previous
as in sort of previous decades in the horror genre, or previous attempts at queer horror, sort of which area of the past you're looking at?
Just I would say maybe just post Haze, so early 70s to current. Sorry, I should have said that clear.
Sure. So I think, again, looking back at the history of the horror genre, it's an interesting thing because on the one hand, oftentimes what would be villainized or what would sort of feed into the representation of the monsters and the scary stuff would be, queer tropes or queer stereotypes, as an attempt to sort of make those things frightening and jarring and out of this world to sort of the normal reader or the normal viewer. But at the same time, the sort of roots of a lot of famous horror stories, a lot of famous horror characters, were made by queer authors, or at least sort of probably that is how they would fall in the modern lens. If you're looking at the sort of personal lives of Mary Shelley or Bram Stoker, or Oscar Wilde, these are, I think, individuals that very well could have been queer people in sort of our modern language today. And so it already is a genre that has a lot of sort of nuance there steeped into it. But certainly from that early period, you ended up seeing, I'm thinking over to films like sort of the way that these horror monsters and scream queens would be portrayed would later go on to have such a big impact on queer culture. And for a lot of viewers of the 70s, the 80s, or even before that, 60s, I think you would find people who were not able to be openly queer, or maybe just didn't have any sort of like the almost zero queer representation in media. But yeah, essentially the I think then as horror went on, definitely in some ways, even though the queerness of it wasn't spoken or even sometimes presented as something villainous, it was something that queer folk latched onto and, adopted creatures, mannerisms, storylines, and kind of made it their own, as that was kind of the element of the story they saw themselves the most in. From there, in the modern day, we've kind of crossed a little bit of a bridge, because now there is horror being made by queer authors, and openly queer authors, and authors who are willing to use that platform of a horror story to talk about queerness, not just as sort of the villain, but as something to introspect or something to sort of dive into in the story itself. So in a way, the horror genre for queer horror has really kind of come full circle a little bit. But that said, I think when we think of queer horror in the modern sense, often it is using the horror genre as a way to explore queer issues or queer identity, and sometimes that comes through just featuring queer characters in and of itself, but more often I think that has to do with what themes are actually being explored in the horror, and the relevance of those themes to queer people, whether it is identity or fitting within your body, or how it is to be received by the community around you, trying to avoid being monstrified or being afraid of it. And so there are, I think the main thing about the queer horror genre as we now think of it is just, it is a place where, in the same way that in your average horror story, we explore fears like what happens if you lose your family, or what happens if there's a strange animal in the woods, or what happens if someone moves to your town that you don't know. In the same way, queer people are able to use this genre to reclaim it a little bit from its past history.
Oh yeah.
And then to explore things that are important to them through the sort of metaphor of the horror.
I absolutely have to agree with that. And it's prevalent in your own story as well. With season 1 of Hello from the Hollowoods, one of the main focuses is not only Percy's identity as both a trans man, but also as a ghost, and how that has influenced his image of himself throughout the seasons after that. And I feel with horror and taking that sense of otherness, it kind of people, queer people especially these days, have taken the ability to take the original reason that queer horror existed in the first place, and kind of recontextualize that reason. Exploring the other, as you said.
Completely.
Yes. So, I guess that kind of also answers the second question, because I was going to ask about why you think other LGBT people are also drawn to horror genre now to express queer identity. But in terms of with tropes, so I know a lot of horror tropes in the past have been harmful, especially towards transgender identities. And I was wondering if you take any of those tropes yourself and how you play with them so they're presented in a different light, if you know if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this is a tricky area in horror, because most of the sort of reason that horror like exists, that it is popular in its decade at a time, is that it represents fears of the public during that time period. And so with that in mind, like some of those fears are completely sort of unfounded or frankly offensive. And so if you look at, you know, the deeper roots of Dracula and like where that comes from, like, you know, fear of like Eastern European people is not like a great sort of base for a character, or kind of the 5 other marginalized peoples that Dracula gets sort of like lumped into or drawn as a like comparison of. And in a similar way, like for then you're looking at those horror tropes, and many of them have sort of a uncomfortable baggage or a sort of a problematic history, and so you do have to kind of inspect or at least hold it very consciously. What does it mean if we do a werewolf character based on like sort of the history of werewolf characters of this genre? What does it mean if we do a vampire character? What does it mean if we do a Frankenstein's monster? And I think you do have to be a little conscious of the history of those things in order to subvert them. Definitely at least the approach that the Hallowoods often takes, and where I've enjoyed coming at it from, is largely a place of where does my interpretation of this thing intersect with the queer themes of the story, and what is the metaphor or what is the sort of thing I'm trying to explore combined with this trope. And beyond that, within the sort of world of the story itself, I'm generally looking for some way to take both make the trope something instantly recognizable as a sort of the latest in a long succession of reimaginings of this trope. Because the Hallowoods is supposed to be a world where every sort of horror trope can coexist. But at the same time, I want to find something intensely human and something very sympathetic and important and meaningful about how each of those characters are portrayed. And so that means coming at it not from the angle of, okay, this is yet another monster, this is how the monster works, this is why it's scary, and, you know, sort of hit send. But this is how the trope intersects with the sort of experience or the person that I'm trying to develop, and how can we sort of find the humanity in this thing and make it kind of walk side by side with the monstrous, and kind of find this really human, sympathetic place even in sort of the schlockiest of horror genre tropes. And that, to me, is part of why I wanted to set out and make a sort of a queer horror story, in that within the sort of stereotypes we have about people, or within the stereotypes that culture has about people, there are these very, you know, human people beneath the surface, beyond the sort of imagining that we have of them. And, you know, it's important to look past sort of that assumption or that sort of bias that you have about the world, and connect with the person that's underneath.
I think you do such a great job with that. Like, because when you were talking about that, my mind immediately went to Shank, and specifically the part in season 5 where they had the run-in with Ignatius and the other deputy, and Riot's just like, Shelby, are we sure we shouldn't just give the police this guy, because like Shank isn't really the greatest person. And then Ignatius gives that one line of he's like, all like, you know, all monsters shouldn't be welcomed here, and he's like, things that died should stay dead, and he's like pointedly saying that to Riot, who basically hasn't really done anything wrong other than being associated with Shank. And I had that like moment where I was sitting there like, oh, with just like, because my mind immediately went like, you're talking about like contextualizing something in like a queer sense. It kind of gave me the idea of like something that I would see just like if you're on the internet a lot, of like sometimes people wanting to villainize certain people who are in a part of a community, whether it's like they're trans, or if they're gay, or if they're like a certain other minority group, specifically for like a couple of quote unquote like bad actors, and how people would use those like bad actors to demonize a whole group of people. And like that was like how I felt when I got to that scene in that episode, was just like that big like oh moment.
Completely. And you know, one of the things that I enjoy so much about this story, and was really one of the hopes of sort of what I wanted to write about 5 years ago when it began, and then still am to this day getting to enjoy, is that it is a place where within the sort of layer of horror and fantasy and crazy stuff that's unfolding in the story, there's the space to talk about these things that I feel are sort of very real issues or concerns or themes that I see in the queer community. And so, you know, there's two of those that you just mentioned, but one of them is the tendency that certain queer folk can have to feel like, okay, I worked hard to get my respect from the world and from straight society. I now have my white picket fence, and I now have my peace and safety. So the rest of you, I'm going to throw under the bus a little bit. I don't care about the rest of you. Like, if it helps me get in with the normal crowd, then I want nothing to do with you freaks. And the problem with that mentality is that, like, in the eyes of the world, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you are a middle-aged gay white dude who, for all intents and purposes, has like a middle management job somewhere, in some radical, non-binary anarchist punk. At the end of the day, you are both still something that differs from the norm, and they will not like favor one over the other so much. I think it's a terrible trap to try and like demonize your fellow queer people to like earn the trust of who. And so that I find frightening in real life, and so of course, you know, it shows up in various places in the story. And then certainly just the other is like the idea of the bad actor. And the truth is, like, there are good and bad people and those people might be straight or they might be queer, but like the sexuality or the gender or however they identify is a separate factor from whether they are a good or a bad person. And you will find excellent, noble, lovely people and terrible people, sort of no matter where you go and in any crowd. And that's one of those things I enjoy trying to challenge as well, is like, this is not necessarily a story where all of the monsters, you know, as far as horror movie tropes go, are nice people. And so there is some weighing and some balance to be had with making opinions about characters like Shank, who on the one hand is a kind of maybe unfairly villainized, but on the other hand does do terrible stuff. And so you kind of have to, he doesn't easily fall into either sort of a good or bad category. And so you really have to sort of sit with your own ideas of what's good and bad and think on him for a bit. And so that was one of the hopes for that character too.
It definitely worked on me because I got super interested in his character very quickly, and I've been like so excited to like see him more. And that one moment in the show was like one of those things that I was like, oh, this is what this feels like. Oh, I can slowly feel him just like becoming one of my more favorite characters in this show. Like when Lady Ethel Mallory got fired, and I like instantly turned her from like being like just one of the meanest characters that I'm like get off the screen, let Nick talk, it's their turn, and then just being like, you are the funniest character in the show now. if that makes sense.
Completely. Well, it's one of the things that, like, Hello from the Hallowoods is a story that takes so much time. It's so long already, and it's not halfway done yet. And so, like,
we're not at the halfway point yet.
We're almost there.
That's good news for me.
It's supposed to run for, hesitantly, the plan is 10 seasons, which is really 9 seasons and an epilogue of sorts. And the downside of making a show like that is that it will take a decade to make. But the plus side is that you have a lot of time with these characters. And so that looks like sometimes characters being introduced early on, but then not really getting their spotlight until later. For instance, Clementine is almost appears like 3 or 4 times in all of season 3. But, with the understanding that, like, okay, we'll have time to sit down with this character a little bit later on. Like, we've got balls in other courts to worry about first. But then also for very long-standing characters like Lady Ethel, kind of have the time to let her be loathsome for a while, and then kind of embark on this journey and this sequence of self-reinventions. And kind of, it's because it is such a long, slow road and such a big canvas, like, there's still a lot of time to sort of let things play out or spend time with characters in the future that we haven't gotten to yet.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I'm not complaining about, it taking a decade to get to your destination, because, the journey, at least in like a storytelling sense, the journey is like part of like the joy of actually being like getting somewhere with something. And
Completely.
I'm excited to see where it goes. And I guess that's just the point I'm gonna make. Is there anything else that you wanted to add in terms of like writing horror? Like anything about like queer horror? You want to give anybody who might be watching this like a little message about, whether it's like anything, just anything?
Absolutely. I would say where queer horror is concerned, there's really 2 reasons I think that it is so important to make, and why I think it is still drastically important for queer people to tell their stories, whether it's through the lens of horror or through a different genre. But the first is that it is it is extremely powerful for queer people to be able to see themselves in stories.
Absolutely.
And at least for myself growing up, like the amount of media that I was limited to did not include the stories of queer people. I really grew up almost isolated entirely from the idea, up until being able to leave home and kind of step into the world and begin to learn about the very real like people that live in it, and to learn about myself. And if I had been able throughout my younger years to read stories where there were queer characters, where there were characters that sort of sat outside gender bounds and were comfortable doing that, those things would have resonated with me, and I probably would have learned a lot about myself a lot sooner by being able to see it elsewhere in the world and know that that was okay, and that was the way that people exist. And so when it comes to creating queer media, like the first demographic is just other people might see this story and feel better about themselves, or feel more comfortable, or feel like, I wasn't sure about my identity or my ownership of this this facet of me, but this character in this story just does it and is cool and isn't worried about it, and like that can be inspiring. So I think for as far as the queer horror genre goes, like it's really important for that reason. But then the other thing is that it might get picked up by people who are not queer, and who do not understand, and might even, in fact, like be resistant or angry or unhappy with the threat that otherness can pose to their life. And for those people, sometimes a story sometimes a story can provide a truth or get them to see a bit of something in a way that they would have been very unhappy about hearing if it was a frank conversation. And so I'm not necessarily going to be able to walk up to someone in a street and say, "Hey, have you heard about non-binary people? And do you agree with the idea of pronouns?" And when it's engaged on this very political front, people might immediately shut down and be like, "Oh, pronouns are stupid. Like I've been told these idiots don't respect language, and everyone should just be normal and stop bothering me." But the same people might listen to a story or read a book and not necessarily even realize that it is about what it is. But then by the end of it, having gotten to see through the eyes of someone else's experience for a little while, understand oh, this isn't just a political thing, and this isn't just a troublemaking young punks thing, but this is a feeling that sits, and they might not choose to come out as non-binary by the end of that story, but they might at least understand a little bit more of the real experience of that thing and understand it, and maybe be a little less hostile in public the next time. And so for that reason, I think it's important to tell queer stories as well, whether they are on sort of wearing that on their sleeve or not. Stories can lead to a lot of understanding, and it can be how people learn more about the world and learn more about the perspectives of other people. And so I think the drive behind queer horror of taking that sort of actively into the genre and being very intentional with it, I think that's important too.
You said that so beautifully. Just media not only can change your perspective of the world around you, but also your perspective of yourself. I think that's exactly how I feel about queer horror stories now. It's just a lot of, at least in my experience, a lot of podcasts definitely have made me feel more seen than if I were to turn on TV and watch an episode of Modern Family,
Completely.
Yeah.
Well, and this is something that's very special and unique about the space of queer podcasts in particular, is that Modern Family has to pass through a board of network executives. It has to be written by a table full of people that have the ability to say yes or no to things. And ultimately, it has to be okay and tame and sanitized enough that the networks that put it on will allow it on television for their, middle of the mark American audience. But with podcasts, there's no barrier to entry and no quality control and no one who can stop you. And so you get authors that, have written their own thoughts the day of and are essentially uploading them in story form to the internet. And so those can often sit a lot more open and a lot more sort of free and down close to the sleeve than your average like TV show or cartoon is ever going to be able to get to. And so it, in the way that it is just almost the internet equivalent of like being handed a zine out in the streets, you definitely can hear some very authentic and very sort of personal experiences written out through these shows.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I my big thing, like at least with a lot of my focus with my art is like podcasts. Not podcasts. Sorry, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I meant webcomics because I write a webcomic, and like I think with like things that are very like internet focused too, leave a lot of room for people to be creative as much as they want without like that looming over threat of like, but is this going to appease to like a majority of people, or are you going to make a certain group too angry? And I think like if anything, you could call like online spaces like its own queer horror story.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
The last thing I'll say about and maybe this is just a product of like how relatively tiny Hello from the Hallowoods is, but there's often going to be a question of how do we market this story? Because the decision for us very early on was, okay, this is going to be a queer horror show. We're going to wear it just on the sleeve. You'll be able to see up front what it is and what it is about. And like not many shows will do that. There will be a ton of shows that have queer representation, that have, it just baked in as part of the heart and soul of the story, but it is, for all intents and purposes, on the internet at large, a horror podcast. And so the difference, I'm not saying this will be the case for everybody, but at least for us, like, I would have expected just so much backlash from random people online for making a queer horror show. And yet the amount of complaints or hate mail or sort of rude comments that we have gotten has been so slim. And I think partially it's just that because we wear that label as a queer horror show, it immediately separates the audience. And it does mean that there's a good portion of the audience that turns away and never gives it a chance because it's a queer thing and they're not into queer things. But it also means that when queer people see it, they understand immediately that where it is coming from and that, it was made for them to some extent. And so, to the horror creator who is not sure, like, whether to wear that proudly, that still is probably a decision that every story has to tackle separately. But it can be, in as much as it narrows your, I guess, potential market, it also can be something that maybe saves you some grief. In like, getting less bombarded on Twitter. The day will come, maybe, someday. But,
I think a day will come.
It has been very chill yet. Yeah.
I think a day will come. Maybe not on Twitter, but hopefully most everywhere else. I mean, Twitter, the mention of Twitter in this will age badly, because that's on its way out so hard. Yeah, that was like my New Year's thing for myself, was leaving Twitter finally. Which is unfortunate, because I did follow a lot of people there who have yet to make the jump, but who knows, that might eventually change.
It definitely has been disheartening to watch the like audio drama community dwindle on there. Justifiably so, but like, you know, as time goes on for online creators, I guess you do have to keep adapting to like what the quickly changing landscape of the internet and where people engage on it looks like. And yeah, when a tech mogul takes over one of your main methods of communication and then sort of turns it into a bankrupt political propaganda platform, it does have some effects on like the way that you get to engage with your other audio drama industry people.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I do see them migrating over to other spaces, but at the same time, like it was a great place for audio drama folks to chat and connect like 2 years ago. But it definitely can't be said quite the same these days.
Yeah, I stuck around specifically for the like audio drama community on there because at least before I left, it was like if I wanted to know anything about audio drama stuff going on, like that's where I went. But then it got to a point where I was just like, I went on there and I was just constantly bombarded with like right-wing propaganda and whatever event Elon Musk had going on that week, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. But I have been seeing, like, it's not a lot, but I have been seeing some audio drama people using Blue Sky more, and I think it's pretty good. Yeah, that's all I can say about it. I very much enjoy using Blue Sky now. I find it better for my mental health.
Completely. Yeah, that is where I see a lot of audio drama folks moving, at least for the sort of short term. And we I think just sort of created our account there like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Definitely always tough to like sort of, you know, start from scratch in terms of followers on one of these platforms, but like that's kind of part and parcel of it.
I literally just went on Blue Sky right now to go follow you because I didn't realize you made a Blue Sky account. Did you want to plug that in while you're here?
Sure. I think on pretty much any social media, we are at the Hallowoods. On Blue Sky, it's at the Hallowoods plus Blue Sky's little add-on. And on Tumblr, I think we are at Hello from the Hallowoods, which is still where we probably hang out the most.
Awesome. Well, unless there's anything else, I think that's a wrap.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking with you.
It's been great talking to you. Thanks again for coming on. So now I want to ask, what is queer horror and how would we define it now? I think a piece of horror media could be considered as queer horror when queer topics are as intertwined with the story as the horror is, and both rely on each other to tell said story. It's why I personally would not call The Walking Dead a piece of modern queer horror, but something like Welcome to Night Vale absolutely is. What I love about modern day queer horror is how people have taken something to talk about the other and find comfort in it. Horror has always been a way for people to communicate their fears, and in a current, uncertain world, there is a lot for people to be afraid of. But I find it comforting that people can find these stories and find them relatable, and finding these kind of stories makes it less isolating as a queer person when you're in a world that tries to insist that you are alone. And I hope you guys can find that kind of comfort too. And that does it for this video. Here is the guy! I have been obsessing over Moriarty so much. I do want to do a video about the story this guy's gonna be in because it's probably the most joyful not project I have ever come up with, and I hope you guys will get around and stick around to me talking about them in full. I want you guys to take joy in it too. I am very much loving what I am cooking. But that is all for this video. I hope you enjoy watching. Please, please, please go give Hello from the Hollywoods a listen. Trust me, you're going to enjoy it. It is such a good show, and I would love more people to scream about it with. All in all though, goodbye, thanks for watching, and have a good one. Bye!